Well, I hope you can hear me better than I can see you, which is about 0, but I'll assume there's some people out there. And if my voice fades, as it tends to do from too much talking, make a ruckus and I'll speak up. It's generally assumed that the events of September 11th changed the world dramatically, that nothing will ever be the same as we move into a new era of human history, an age of terror, as it was called. That's the title of the first book of academic essays that came out shortly after September 11th, Yale University professors mostly. They regarded the anthrax attacks, which they attributed to bin Laden, as even more ominous than what had happened at September 11th. And it's clear that the world has changed. So take, say, Iraq, what's on everybody's mind. Since September 11th, Iraq has become a threat to our very existence. So according to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, the next bit of evidence we're likely to discover about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction will be a mushroom cloud. She didn't say where, but presumably that means in New York or Washington. The neighboring countries don't seem to perceive the threat. Actually, they're worried, all right, but they're worried about the United States and its attack on Iraq, and not about Saddam Hussein. Interestingly, that's true even of Kuwait and Iran, two countries that were invaded by Saddam Hussein when he was a U.S. ally. The countries of the region are trying to reestablish relations with Iraq and reintegrate it into their system, so presumably they don't expect a mushroom cloud. Well, that's since September 11th. Before September 11th, we weren't facing that threat of destruction from Iraq, so surely September 11th changed something, brought about a major change, undoubtedly. Well, if we want to understand the world, not just follow marching orders, we're going to ask what the change was. Was it a change in an objective threat? Was it a change even in a perceived threat, or was it a change in opportunity? That is, an opportunity to pursue goals that are in fact long-standing. Now, that's a pretty serious question. It should be the central topic of discussion and commentary, at least for those who want to understand the world, to get some picture of where it's going, and not simply to join a cheering section. And that's the question, the background question that I'm going to have in mind in these remarks. And many sort of side questions immediately come up. I mean, for example, the claim is that the problem with Iraq is that what we have to do is get rid of Saddam Hussein, regime change, eliminate the possibilities of any capabilities of developing weapons of mass destruction, maybe on the side, gain access to Iraq's oil. Well, if those are the goals, there are some simple ideas that come to mind about how to achieve them. They're not ever discussed. One might ask why they're never discussed. I could go on with that, maybe later if you're interested, but I'll keep to some more general, broader background issues about world order and about how we might proceed to understand it. Well, there's surely some truth to the idea that September 11th changed the world. The target on September 11th was not Cuba or Nicaragua or Lebanon or Chechnya or any of the other traditional victims of large-scale international terrorism. Rather, the target in this case was a state with awesome power to shape the future, In fact, power with absolutely no historical precedent. So it follows at once that if we want to gain a realistic picture of the likely future, we're going to investigate the U.S. government, its policies, its past policies, its present policies, and the roots of those policies in the institutions of the country. That's just elementary sanity. And that would be true no matter who happened to be in office. It's dramatically true when power is in the hands of people we know all about, people who have an ample record of exercising power. Most of those with their hands on the levers of power are recycled Reaganites, and they have a record that we know a lot about. Those are facts that ought to be in the forefront of our attention, particularly because their record runs right through the 1990s as well, and not just in the United States. So say take Richard Perle. People in the Washington press corps have told me that journalists there refer to him as Darth Vader. I can't vouch for that, but could be true. He's an influential planner now, as he was during the Reagan years. And a few years ago, 5 years ago, he was writing position papers for Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who is well to the right of Ariel Sharon in the Israeli spectrum. And those connections are very close. The ultra-right in Israel and the power brokers here, as the Israeli press is commonly discussing. And the position papers that he and Doug Fieth were writing, they have earlier roots, and they have a good deal of resonance in current geopolitical planning, geostrategic planning, going back to the 80s, in fact. Again, as the Israeli press, which is usually pretty well informed, has been pointing out. Well, those are things we ought to be thinking about. There are some other facts that should be prominent in our minds as well. One is that it has been recognized for some years, long before September 11th, that with new technologies, the rich and powerful states are going to lose their monopoly, virtual monopoly of the means of violence. They'll retain an overwhelming preponderance as they do, but it won't be a monopoly. So a couple of years before September 11th, just to quote one of many technical papers, it points out that a well-planned, I'm quoting, a well-planned operation to smuggle weapons of mass destruction into the United States would have a 90% probability of success, far greater than a missile attack with or without national missile defense, even if it worked. That's what's been called America's Achilles heel, the title of a major book published a couple of years before September 11th by a number of well-known strategic analysts and technical experts. If you read the book, you'll find it's virtually a guidebook for terrorists, various things they could do. All of this has been evident, and in fact it's been evident to everyone with their eyes open at least since 1993. Remember that in 1993, groups related to Al-Qaeda tried to blow up the World Trade Center and came very close. Estimates are that with better planning, they could have carried it off and killed tens of thousands of people, and their ambitions were much broader. They also targeted the FBI building, the UN buildings, tunnels under the Hudson River. Were caught before they could do it, but they were on their way. And as I said, with better planning, might have succeeded. Well, the political leadership certainly knows that. U.S. intelligence certainly knew it as well. So did strategic analysts, and in fact, careful readers of the press were well aware of it also. The fact that a similar attempt was successful on September 11th does not really seriously affect the threat assessments. They were there before, and they remain, and the reasons for them are understood pretty well. There has been some success since September 11th in dismantling networks of the Al-Qaeda variety. By far the greatest success has been in Europe, primarily in Germany, through careful police work, which had some real successes. The bombing of Afghanistan, at least according to U.S. intelligence, had almost no effect. That was just reiterated in this morning's newspapers reporting the analysis by the George Tenet, CIA head, to Congress yesterday, who, according to the reports, says that the threats today are about the same as they were before September 11th, so whatever has been done hasn't changed that. There is a footnote to all of this. As the CIA pointed out a couple of weeks ago, just repeating the obvious, you don't need an intelligence agency to tell you this, the threats would increase, maybe significantly, if the U.S. were to attack Iraq. And that's for pretty obvious reasons. Put yourself into Saddam Hussein's shoes and you can figure it all out. The worst case analysis, which is by no means unimaginable, is that what are called loose nukes might find their way into hands of fanatics bent on revenge, and remember the 90% probability of success. So there surely are ways of increasing the threats. And there are some folks not too far from here who are pursuing plans that are very likely to have exactly that consequence, as they perfectly well know. Well, on September 11th, the threats were realized with wickedness and awesome cruelty, to borrow the words of the most distinguished member of the Middle East International Press Corps, Robert Fisk, right away capturing the world reaction of shock and horror and sympathy for the innocent victims. And it was a major event, not only because of the scale. It's the first time in modern history, ever maybe, that the rich and powerful countries, the Western countries, have suffered on home soil atrocities of the kind that are unfortunately all too familiar elsewhere. The history should be familiar enough so that there's no need to review it. The West may prefer to forget it. The victims surely don't. That's a sharp break in the traditional pattern, and that means that it was a historic event of great importance. The repercussions are sure to be significant. Well, what those will be, what the consequences will be, that'll be determined substantially by policy choices in the United States. So we're back to the obvious. If we want to understand anything, we will therefore begin with an investigation of U.S. power, how it's exercised, particularly in the very recent past up till now, how it's interpreted within the political culture. That's assuming minimal rationality. Actually, it's a minority opinion. It's considered so extreme that it scarcely appears within mainstream discussion, as you can determine for yourselves. And if it's even mentioned or noticed, it elicits near hysteria, which is, we can learn something from that. It's also illuminating to see how the record of the very recent past, how frequently it's even mentioned, let alone investigated in any serious way, in the reams of commentary on the so-called war on terror that was redeclared on September 11th. Let me stress, redeclared. It requires really impressive subordination to state violence not to notice that the war was actually declared 20 years earlier as the Reagan administration came to office with very much the same rhetoric and many of the same people in leading positions. Well, surely the record of the first phase of the so-called war on terror is relevant, highly relevant, to understanding the redeclared war, at least if understanding is preferred to blind faith. And that's particularly true because the shocking record of U.S.-backed international terrorism during those years continued in the years that followed, up to the present. But all that's buried deep in the memory hole, not, however, among the victims. It's also instructive to study the various devices that are used within the political and intellectual culture to overcome the threat of understanding. The simplest one is just deceit and evasion. Too many examples even to bother mentioning. A slightly less dishonest approach is the appeal to a kind of miraculous conversion. So according to this idea, yes, there were flaws in the past, but now they're overcome, so we can forget all that boring and irrelevant stuff about facts and other nonsense like that up to, say, 2 minutes ago, and we can march on to a righteous future. That's a very useful doctrine, kind of doctrine of change of course, wipe out history. It's invoked every few years. In fact, I've reviewed a lot of cases in print, but all that's irrelevant because this time it's different. How do we know it's different? Well, it's different because we say it's different, so therefore it's different. It's instructive to review examples, including some very recent ones. I'll again skip that for lack of time. You can return if you like. There is a scholarly variant of this, which is more serious. That does recognize that the historical record is pretty ugly, but the thesis is that we can dismiss all of that as what's called the abuse of reality, which is to be distinguished from reality itself. I'm quoting now. Reality itself is the unachieved national purpose, which is transcendent. When you get big words like transcendent, you know you're in academic scholarship. The transcendent national purpose is the establishment of equality and freedom. And if there's a departure from it, that's just abuse of reality. Actually, I'm quoting the founder of what's called realist international relations theory, and I want to stress that I'm not quoting it in criticism. He happens to have been a fine scholar and an unusually decent person. Few like him in the professional fields. Well, that happened to be 40 years ago. There's a current version of this, produced right around September 11th by a prominent and respected scholar in a leading prestigious journal. He writes that there's a guiding principle that defines the parameters within which the policy debate occurs. And this guiding principle is so authoritative as to be virtually immune from challenge, apart from tattered remnants of the right and the left. The principle is that history has a discernible direction and destination, and uniquely among the nations of the world, the United States comprehends and manifests history's purpose. Okay? Follows then that U.S. hegemony is the realization of history's purpose, and it's necessarily for the common good, and furthermore this is a truism, so that facts are irrelevant. We should simply stand there and worship at the shrine. There's a kind of a vulgar version of this that you read day after day from the president and commentators and so on. And this doctrine is not an innovation. It has a rather distinguished pedigree, in fact. It goes back a long time. So, for example, a century before Rumsfeld and Cheney, Woodrow Wilson called for the conquest of the Philippines because, as he put it, our interest must march forward, altruists though we are. Other nations must see to it that they stand off and do not seek to stay us. sounds familiar, as we proceed to liberate the Philippines, also liberating several 100,000 souls from life's torments. There were some critics, some obscure folk like Mark Twain, for example, and since fortunately we live in a free society, his criticisms, very bitter anti-imperialist essays, these are readily available. It's true 90 years later, but you can't have everything. And when they appeared without a comment, at least that I could find, apart from the usual scoundrels. And Wilson was just drawing from the highest peaks of European Enlightenment in this regard, as anyone who's paid attention to the history knows very well. Well, all of that's one choice. The other choice is to understand reality to be reality, and to ask whether the unpleasant record of reality consists of flaws in the pursuit of history's purpose, or whether it has more mundane causes, as in the case of every other power system, past and present. That's a position that's known as anti-Americanism, or hating America in the technical literature. Well, if we adopt that stance, saying U.S. is like everyone else, and we join the tattered remnants that don't fall within the authoritative spectrum, I think we would be led to conclude, with regard to the main topic tonight, that policy choices are likely to remain pretty stable within a framework that's pretty well entrenched, enhanced, no doubt, perhaps in important ways, but fundamentally unchanged. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is the stability of the basic institutions. Power decisions do flow from them. But there are also narrower reasons, which merit a good deal of attention, I think. One of them I've already mentioned, the fact that the war on terror on September 11th was redeclared with the same rhetoric just 20 years before and most of the same people in charge. Remember that the Reagan administration came into office in 1991, announcing that a main focus of U.S. policy will be terrorism, particularly state-sponsored international terrorism. It's a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. Actually, I'm quoting the administration moderate, George Shultz, who was the Colin Powell of his day. Well, the war on terrorism that was announced in 1981, that was going to focus on two areas where the plague was raging with unusual virulence. That was Central America and the Middle East. The greatest threat to civilization was Central America. There was a cancer right here in our landmass, which was planning to conquer the hemisphere and destroy the United States, openly announcing the goals of Mein Kampf. That's all George Shultz again. Well, luckily for us, the White House was occupied by a brave cowboy who stopped it. He declared a national emergency because, I'll quote his words, because the policies and the actions of the government of Nicaragua constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. He even had to bomb Libya for that reason. Libya was bringing the war home to the United States, he said, by providing arms to these monsters who were just on the verge of conquering the hemisphere. And that was part of the mad dog Gaddafi's effort to expel America from the world, the cowboy told us. So if you think there's a threat today, just remember what a narrow escape we had just a few years ago when it was really close. And it's not that people weren't frightened. It's very easy to frighten people. Every leader, dictator, Democrat, everyone else knows that. It's the last resort of real scoundrels and very effective. Well, that was one locus of the threat, the cancer right here in our hemisphere. The second locus, hardly less dreadful, was the Middle East Mediterranean region. If you run through the record of the 1980s, the Reagan years, that was constantly one of the top stories of the year. In the year 1985, it was in fact picked as the top story of the year in the annual poll, Associated Press poll of editors, and it ranked very high in other years. This also happens to be the primary focus of the redeclared war on terror. So again, rationality tells us that a closer look is very important, at least if we want to understand what's happening now and what lies ahead. Well, let's just take the peak year, 1985. What were the top terrorist acts of the region in that year? Well, there are actually three contenders. One of them was a car bombing in Beirut. Truck car bomb was was outside a mosque, timed to go off when people were leaving the mosque, and it did. It killed 80 people, mostly women and girls. It was a very powerful bomb, ripped up houses all the way down the street, killed infants in their beds, wounded a couple hundred people. However, that doesn't count. That's not part of the canon of terrorism. The reason is it was traced back to the CIA and British intelligence, so it's kind of off the record. The second contender for chief terrorist act in the region was the Israeli bombing of Tunis with no credible pretext. They barely tried, killed 75 people, also 85, expedited by the United States, praised by the United States right after the bombing and the killings. George Shultz called his Israeli counterpart to congratulate him and express U.S. support for this wonderful act. The U.S. sort of backed off and began to keep quiet about it when the Security Council met and condemned it unanimously, U.S. abstaining, as an act of armed aggression. Actually, notice that's worse than international terrorism. That means Nuremberg trials. But let's give the benefit of the doubt to the United States and its client and call it only international terrorism. The third contender for the prize was the so-called, what the Israeli government called its Iron Fist operations in southern Lebanon, occupied southern Lebanon. This is under the dovish labor government, Shimon Peres. The targets of the operations were what the high command called terrorist villagers. The atrocities reached new depths of calculated brutality and arbitrary murder, in the words of a Western diplomat in the area, amply supported by press coverage, mostly abroad, but some even here, plenty in Israel. Murder, atrocities, kidnapping, taking people back to prison in Israel, and so on. That's the third act. Nobody knows the numbers, probably hundreds. Well, those are the three peak examples of international terrorism, or maybe worse, in the peak year of 1985. However, if you look at the scholarly literature, and certainly media, they don't count. They don't enter the canon. Two incidents do enter the canon, exactly two. In each of them, one person was killed, in each case an American. And those are not forgotten. Well, that tells you something about what terrorism is. It has nothing to do with terrorism. It has to do with whether they do it to us or we do it to them. And that's important to understand when you want to know something about the war on terror. The worst, and that's not a U.S. innovation, incidentally. As far as I know, that practice is universal, even among the worst mass murderers. So say, take the Nazis. They didn't say that they were carrying out terror in occupied Europe. They were carrying out what they called counter-terror. They were protecting the population against the terrorism of the partisans who were terrorists directed from abroad. And like all propaganda, you can imagine there's an element of truth to that. The partisans did resort to terror. They surely were directed from abroad. Nobody tried to deny that. And governments like Vichy had about as much legitimacy as kinds of governments the U.S. and its allies set up throughout much of the world. And in fact, if there's an exception to this practice, I've yet to find it. So the U.S. is breaking no ground on that. It's not a nice precedent, but it's not an innovation. Well, the worst atrocity, terrorist atrocity, if not aggression, of that period, the 1980s in the Middle East region, was the U.S.-backed Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which killed about 20,000 people. There wasn't even a pretext of self-defense. The operation was taken, as was openly proclaimed in Israel, in order to undermine efforts to reach a political settlement of the occupied territories that the United States and Israel didn't want. Well, that's a textbook example of international terrorism, again, if not aggression, in which case we call for Nuremberg trials. Without going on, in both of those two regions, both of the two regions which were the focus of the war on terror, the terrorist commanders in Washington, who are now once again in charge, they did compile a record of atrocities that vastly exceeded anything that could be attributed to their targets. In Central America, ended up with hundreds of thousands of people killed, 4 countries devastated, judgment of the World Court ordering the United States to cease its unlawful use of force, which is international terrorism. That was backed by the Security Council, or would have been, except that the U.S. vetoed a resolution supporting the World Court judgment and calling on all states to observe international law, considered so insignificant it was barely even reported here. The U.S. responded by escalating the terrorist war. That was the response to the order to terminate it, with including the first official orders to attack what the High Command called soft targets, meaning undefended civilian targets, with the approval of liberal opinion, incidentally. The prime target throughout, one prime target was the church, which the U.S. was fighting with, Catholic Church, which the U.S. was attacking with as much passion and intensity as it now directs to radical Islam. The church had committed a grave sin. The Latin American church had turned towards what was called the preferential option for the poor. Priests and nuns and others were working to organize poor peasants, help them take control over their lives. That's a sin. That's a crime. Can't be tolerated. The School of the Americas, famous School of the Americas, now proclaims that one of what's called its talking points, that explains why it's a great place, that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology, which is quite true. It's symbolic that that hideous decade in Central America began with the assassination of an archbishop who had become a voice for the voiceless, ended with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, and of course tens of thousands of the usual victims, and they're all unknown. You can do an experiment and ask your educated friends how many people have read anything written by the 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals who had their brains blown out by elite forces armed and trained by the United States, who can even remember their names. If they had been Czech intellectuals who had suffered anything like that under the Russians, you'd know about it, but not in this case. It's an important principle that you should never know anything about your own crimes. And their educational system and intellectual culture are carefully designed to ensure that outcome. You can test it in this rather striking case. That's not the only example of Washington-based international terrorism in the 1980s. Another example is very much prominent right now, Iraq. Through the 1980s, Saddam Hussein did carry out horrendous atrocities. You can read Condoleezza Rice this morning explaining that we can't let this terrible man survive. He used chemical warfare in his war against Iran. He even used chemical warfare against his own people. Incidentally, they were his own people in the sense that the Cherokees were Andrew Jackson's own people, but we can forget that. Rice is absolutely correct. He carried all those atrocities, by far his worst crimes. She didn't mention, following the convention, that all of this was done with our help. I can't say that part. And it continued. The help had nothing to do with the Cold War. Clearly, Russia was also helping. It didn't have anything to do with the Iran-Iraq war either. We continued to give them the same assistance well after the worst atrocities that are now charged were well known, after the Iran-Iraq war was over. And the reasons were quite frankly stated. So the White House explained that providing Saddam Hussein with dual-use technology that enables him to develop weapons of mass destruction, which was in fact what was happening, those give great trade opportunities for U.S. companies and contribute to the stability of the region by supporting a moderate state. That went on right up to virtually the day of the invasion of Kuwait. Last couple of weeks before the invasion, George Bush #1 approved the sale of advanced data transmission equipment to his friendly SOB, as he was called. In the preceding couple of weeks, licenses had been approved for about $5 million worth of advanced technology products. That included computers for the Ministry of Industry and Military Industrialization, and a research center that shortly after was destroyed by bombing on the grounds that it was developing rockets and poison gas, and another plant that was repeatedly bombed as a chemical weapons factory, and that's only a small piece of it. That went on, in fact, in the spring of 1990. George Bush #1, who I guess is hiding out in Texas somewhere, he sent a high-level senatorial delegation to visit his friend. This is the spring of 1990, right before the invasion of Kuwait. It was headed by Bob Dole, later Republican presidential candidate. They brought George Bush's greetings, informed Saddam that he shouldn't be bothered too much by the criticism he's getting from the press here. We've got this free press thing, which is pretty hard to control, and sometimes reporters go off in weird directions. One of the senators even suggested to Saddam that he invite the press to come to Iraq so they could see for themselves and stop this criticism. So yes, all of these hideous crimes took place with our aid and support, and the British as well. In fact, the British were a little slow on the draw, and they continued to provide Saddam with technology usable for weapons of mass destruction even a couple of days after the invasion of Kuwait. It took a little time to cut it off. So yes, there were further atrocities in the 1980s during the so-called War on Terror. Well, that doesn't exhaust the record by any means. Things are happening elsewhere in the world too. So, for example, take Africa. Washington's South African ally during the Reagan years alone was responsible for killing about 1.5 million people, over $60 million of damage in the neighboring countries, forgetting South Africa. Meanwhile, Reagan was evading congressional sanctions and, in fact, even increased trade in the late 80s. UNICEF estimated that about 850,000 infants and young children were killed during those years, 150,000 of them in the neighboring countries. This is under South African attack. 150,000 of them in 1998. 1988, sorry. That's the year when Washington announced officially that it condemned officially what they called one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That's Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. That's the end of the Reagan years, 1988. Well, that's just a brief glance at the first phase of the war on terror. It was a real age of terror, far beyond anything suffered by the rich and powerful then or now, but all out of history. You can check for yourselves, and in fact, you know without checking that none of this is considered relevant to the redeclared war on terror. The base of U.S. terrorist operations in Central America was Honduras. The ambassador to Honduras in the first part of the Reagan years was John Negroponte, who's now in charge of the diplomatic component of the new redeclared war on terror at the United Nations. The Reagan special envoy to the Middle East was Donald Rumsfeld, who's now Secretary of Defense. The National Security Advisor in the final years of the so-called war on terrorism is Colin Powell. Other leading figures then have now reappeared and hold prominent and important positions. Have they changed in some way? If so, what's the evidence? Has anybody asked whether they've changed? No. Of course, what they did then is considered apparently perfectly okay, maybe praiseworthy, and therefore irrelevant to the redeclared war with the same people and the same rhetoric. Furthermore, that continues right through the 1990s. Clinton just took it over and extended it. It's enough to have a look at the leading recipients of U.S. military aid and take a look at what they were up to. The leading recipients were, in the Clinton years, Turkey and Colombia, both of which have hideous human rights records. I just won't go into it, but just as a personal aside, the last couple of months I happened to have visited the scenes of some of the worst, most grisly terrorist atrocities of the 1990s, terrible decade, southeastern Turkey and later in southern Colombia, where they're still continuing, including U.S. chemical warfare, which is having a devastating effect. That's putting aside Israel and Egypt. They are a separate category, one that's not pleasant to review and quite pertinent to the question of international terrorism and the prospects for the future. Well, without going into that, let me just repeat the obvious. We've got two choices. One is history is bunk, as Henry Ford said. We can march forward with confidence that the global enforcer will drive evil from the world, just as his speechwriters declare, plagiarizing ancient epics and children's fairy tales. That's one choice. The other choice is that we can look at the record and the doctrines of the proclaimed new era, subject them to scrutiny, and maybe get some sense of the emerging reality. If there's a third way, I don't see it. Let me just, of the innumerable examples that one can give to illustrate, you can list a lot of them superficially, but let's take one major one and just look at it a little more carefully, see what we can learn from it. It's very pertinent today and to the war on terror. So right at this moment, right now, everyone's eyes are or should be focused on the Cuban Missile Crisis 40 years ago. And it's right to do so. That was the most dangerous moment in human history, Arthur Schlesinger just observed correctly, historian and Kennedy advisor. The world was literally minutes away from destruction. We've just learned some startling facts about it just in the last few weeks. We learned that the Northern Hemisphere survived because of one Russian submarine captain, Vasily Arkhipov, who convinced his fellow officers not to fire nuclear missiles at one of the tensest moments of the missile crisis when they were attacked by U.S. destroyers off Cuba. If he hadn't countermanded that order, it would have led to a nuclear exchange, and that would have effectively have been the end. That's how close it was. That's kind of relevant to what's happening right now, not only the war on Iraq that the administration is determined to wage and will unless it can be stopped from within, but also the so-called war on terror, particularly because of the role of Cuba in the war on terror. Remember, Cuba has been an official terrorist state for 40 years, still is. So let's have a look at Cuba's record as a terrorist state. Well, here's what happened. The Batista dictatorship, which the U.S. had backed, was overthrown in January 1959. That's when Castro took over. 2 months later, in March, a lot of materials come out from the declassified record on this. In March, 2 months later, the U.S. National Security Council began to consider means to institute what's now called regime change, that is, overthrow the government. 2 months. In May, 2 months later, the CIA began to arm anti-Castro guerrillas inside Cuba. Flights over Cuba by planes based in Florida, they began a couple of months later in October. In July 1960, Cuba called on the United Nations for help. It provided the Security Council with detailed records of a couple of dozen bombings, including names of pilots, plane registration numbers, unexploded bombs they'd found, and so on, and it alleged considerable damage and casualties. The U.S. ambassador responded by giving what he called his assurance that the United States has no aggressive purpose against Cuba. 4 months before that, as he certainly knew, a formal decision had been made in secret to overthrow the government, and preparations for the Bay of Pigs invasion were well advanced. Notice that lying is not a new invention designed for Iraq, worth keeping in mind. Well, this March 1960 decision for regime change called for overthrow of Castro in favor of a regime, I'm quoting, more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the United States. Those two notions are taken to be synonymous. Intelligence at that point reported that support for Castro was high, people were optimistic, but the United States would determine the true interests of the Cuban people. The plans also called for keeping the U.S. role in regime change secret out of concern for the effect elsewhere, particularly in Latin America. Shortly after came the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was beaten back. John F. Kennedy ordered his staff to unleash the terrors of the earth against Cuba because of its successful defiance of the United States. These are mostly quotes. This was not just resistance to invasion. Kennedy planners warned of the impact the very existence of Castro's regime has upon leftist movements in many Latin American countries. Its very existence represents a successful defiance of the United States, a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half, based on the principle of subordination to the U.S. will, history's purpose, as scholars tell us. The basic problem was, still reading the internal record, Cuba was providing an example and general stimulus that might encourage agitation and radical change in other parts of Latin America where social and economic conditions invite opposition to ruling authority and susceptibility to the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands. And those are grave dangers when the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. Well, as if that wasn't bad enough, there was also the successful resistance to a U.S. invasion, which is an intolerable threat to what's called credibility, and that warranted the terrors of the earth and destructive economic warfare to excise the cancer. Actually, there was a public doctrine also announced by Dean Acheson, a senior statesman and top Kennedy advisor. In 1962, he informed the American Society of International Law that no legal challenge arises in the case of no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to any challenge to its power, prestige, its power, position, or prestige. Okay, so if there's a U.S. response, say, who knows what, nuclear war, to a challenge to U.S. power, position, and prestige, that's not a legal issue. It's nothing that concerns the UN or World Court or anyone else. That doctrine from the extreme liberal wing of the spectrum appears to go beyond even the recent Bush doctrine just announced, so-called, which grants Washington the right to resort to violence against any perceived threat anywhere in the world. Perhaps an illustration of the breadth of the political spectrum in elite circles. Well, in the Kennedy planning documents, Russia is indeed mentioned. It's mentioned as hovering in the background, offering development loans, presenting itself as a model for development in a single generation. Actually, that's a large part of the reason for the Cold War ever since 1917. Interesting topic, also well documented. Going back to terrorism, in November 1961, under Kennedy, a special secret group was established to carry out anti-Cuba terrorism. That's Operation Mongoose, run from a CIA station in Miami. The Cubans and the Russians took Kennedy's terrorist attacks to be preliminary to invasion. The Secretary of Defense McNamara has recently agreed that this was a plausible judgment. From their point of view, he said he would have reached it himself in their shoes, though he claims it wasn't planned. He also pointed out that if there had been an invasion, that would have led with 99% probability to nuclear war. In February 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we've just learned, approved a plan to concoct a pretext that would allow the United States to invade and destroy Castro with speed, force, and determination, quoting secret document. In the weeks right before the missile crisis, a terrorist group based in Florida approved a plan to carried out, in fact, attacks, speedboat strafing attacks on a seaside hotel in Cuba, right near Havana, killing 20 Russians and Cubans. Shortly after, they attacked British and Cuban cargo ships and again raided Cuba along with a lot of other terrorist actions that were stepped up in early October, while Congress passed a resolution which, quoting it, sanctioned the use of force, if necessary, to restrain Cuban aggression and subversion in the Western Hemisphere, and voted to withhold aid from any country trading with this terrorist state. At one of the tensest moments of the missile crisis, a terrorist team dispatched from Washington blew up a Cuban industrial facility, killing 400 workers, according to Cuban sources that are taken quite seriously by senior U.S. analysts. I leave it to your imagination to say what would have happened if that had been reversed. That continued after the missile crisis ended. 10 days before his assassination, Kennedy authorized new and more extreme terrorist attacks, and it continued later, peaked in the late 70s. Again, pretty serious. Included poisoning crops and livestock, contaminating sugar exports, blowing up a civilian aircraft, killing 73 people, and plenty more. In fact, it was still going on in the 90s, still based in Florida, where the perpetrators are protected from punishment or extradition, not to speak of Washington itself. If you read George Bush's recent national security strategy document, you'll recall that One of the injunctions is that we now treat terrorism as equivalent to genocide, the most serious of crimes, and that any state that is involved in any way in this crime must be destroyed, its leadership either punished or killed. Commentators were kind enough not to point out that George Bush ought to quickly be sent to Guantanamo for inciting commentators, in fact, passed that over quietly. Notice that we're now sampling the liberal extreme of the political spectrum. Cuba's crimes became even more immense in the mid-70s when it served as the instrument of Russia's crusade to dominate the world, so Washington announced. 1975, UN Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who ranks very high in the liberal pantheon, he thundered that if Soviet neocolonialism succeeds in Angola, the world will not be the same in the aftermath. Europe's oil routes will be under Soviet control, as will the strategic South Atlantic, with the next target on the Kremlin's list being Brazil. Sounds kind of familiar. Washington's fury in this case was caused by another Cuban act of successful defiance. A U.S.-backed South African invasion right then was close to conquering a newly independent Angola in 1975. Cuba sent troops to the government on its own initiative, scarcely even notifying the Russians, and they beat back the invaders, another act of successful defiance. This one had large-scale effects. The South African press warned of the boost to African nationalism, which has seen South Africa forced to retreat, and U.S. officials agreed. They concluded that the defeat of Washington's South African ally had blurred the image of South African and white mercenary invincibility and stimulated all the wrong feelings among those people. All of that is now very well established in the most respected scholarship. Washington and South Africa didn't take it lightly. Atrocities by Washington's South African ally and its favorite terrorist commander, Jonas Savimbi, practically destroyed Angola in the Reagan years, reversing gains of the early independence period. I've already mentioned that. Well, this 40-year campaign to unleash the terrors of the earth against Cuba qualifies uncontroversially as international terrorism and of a scale and character that doesn't have many counterparts. Thousands of people were killed, terrible effect on the society and the economy, but it doesn't count for the usual reasons. It does not constitute international terrorism. It was compounded by economic warfare of unprecedented severity. That became even harsher, as I'm sure you know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which eliminated the Soviet pretext, which was fraudulent, as we know from internal documents. And it's quite interesting to see how the U.S. doctrinal system didn't miss a beat as the pretext switched. Actually, that happened in quite interesting ways across the board at the time. Since Clinton, the U.S. embargo effectively bans even food and medicine. The health consequences are severe. They were reviewed in some detail by an extensive study of the American Association for World Health a couple of years ago, which concluded that only Cuba's remarkable healthcare system had prevented what they called humanitarian catastrophe, received virtually no mention in the United States. U.S. economic warfare has been bitterly condemned in every relevant international forum. It was even declared illegal by the Judicial Commission of the normally compliant Organization of American States. The European Union called on the World Trade Organization to condemn the embargo. And the Clinton administration had an official response, namely as follows. Europe is challenging 3 decades of American-Cuba policy that goes back to the Kennedy administration and is aimed entirely at forcing a change of government in Havana, what's now called regime change, supposedly an innovation. The U.S. withdrew from the World Trade Organization proceedings, rendering the issue moot. Well, these 40 years of international terrorism and economic warfare to impose regime change, still continuing, are well known, but they're considered quite legitimate in elite sectors, so obviously legitimate that they're never even brought up in the debates about the allegedly novel Bush doctrine of bringing about regime change as Washington chooses. That's the usual practice with regard to one's own crimes, and we rightly deplore it when it takes place in totalitarian states, where at least apologists can plead fear and extenuation. Well, there are plenty more examples. I can go on if you want, but let me stop with that. It's an illustrative one. Cuba's probably the target of more international terrorism than maybe most of the rest of the world combined in the last 40 years, but didn't count any more than the peak examples of 1985 in the Middle East, or what happened in anything that happened in the first phase of the war on terror that was redeclared by the same people with the same rhetoric on September 11th. Well, plenty more to say about this, but reviewing the record, I think it's not unreasonable to conclude that the crimes of September 11th, which were certainly real, offered opportunities to extend plans that were already in place. The Bush doctrine of preemption is an illustration. Plenty of antecedents going back to Atchison's declaration in 1962 and the acts that went along with it, in fact many before that. The new one is novel in its brazen formulation, but it's otherwise pretty familiar. And the same is true of the plans for unilateral world domination through absolute military superiority, which make the United States a menace to itself and the world under this administration's leadership. Actually, I'm quoting from Senior Associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Anatol Yevin, a highly respected commentator who is reflecting the opinion of a good bit of the world, maybe almost all of it. It was predicted at once that the September 11th atrocities would be a catastrophe for the Palestinians and indeed for other suffering and oppressed people, and that proved to be true. Governments all over the place seized on September 11th as a kind of window of opportunity to escalate harsh and repressive programs already underway. The Russians in Chechnya, China and Western China, Indonesia and Aceh, Israel and the occupied territories, and others, assuming that they could now continue and in fact escalate the atrocities with the approval of the boss in Washington under the pretext of war on terror. Governments also used the opportunity to try to discipline their own populations, including here, meaning to carry forward unpopular programs under the guise of combating terrorism, demanding what's called patriotism. Patriotism means you shut up and I'll pursue my own agenda relentlessly. And that happened. That was instant, and it was pointed out right in the mainstream. So Paul Krugman, outstanding economist, who's incidentally writing really remarkable regular columns in the New York Times, pointed out right away that 48 hours after the terrorist attacks, right-wing Republicans tried to ram through a sharp cut in the capital gains tax. 80% of the benefits would go to 2% of taxpayers, signaling, in his words, that they were determined to use terrorism as an excuse to pursue a radical right-wing agenda. He and others, plenty of others, have been documenting their successes ever since. These are recycled Reaganites, remember, and they did right away the same thing they did when the Reagan administration came in. They quickly drove the country into deep deficit so that Alan Greenspan can appear and soberly explain that we have to have fiscal discipline. That means huge benefits for the rich by regressive fiscal measures and crumbs at best for everyone else. In general, the assault against the general population in the interests of quite narrow sectors of power continues. These are the sectors that the Reagan-Bush political managers serve with even more than the usual dedication. I believe there are a few examples familiar in Houston. Well, there's only one way to get rid of, to carry out such programs, to get away with them. Only one way has ever been known, that is, terrify the population. I remember that the last cowboy in office was wailing about how the Sandinistas are only 2 days marching time from Texas, and Gaddafi was going to expel America from the world, and so on, and it kind of worked. And the same familiar story is being relived in current propaganda. If you were a Bush campaign manager and you're thinking about the coming, either this election or more crucially the 2004 presidential election, the last thing you want is for people to be asking questions about how they're going to take care of their elderly mother, or where my pension is, or why medical costs are out of sight, or about the destruction of an environment in which maybe my grandchildren might survive, or the takeover of public goods by unaccountable private tyrannies, shrinking narrowly what's left of democracy, or the construction of new weapon systems that pose a real threat to human survival. It's not an exaggeration. That's all the wrong things for them to be looking at, plenty more. Rather, what they're supposed to be doing is chanting praises to the grand leader who miraculously saved them from an awesome danger, and by then will be marching on to some new triumph. That's an old story, not just in the United States, of course. The German Minister of Justice was recently fired because she dared to make some true and elementary comments about this, but they remain true and elementary. Well, let me return finally to the same choices that we have always had. One choice is to worship our leaders and to paint gratifying pictures of the wondrous future that lies ahead under our benign guidance, realizing the history's directions. A second choice is to take the rich historical and current record seriously, to draw reasonable conclusions, and to make use of the ample opportunities that we are lucky enough to enjoy to change the course on which we're being led. Thank you.
Professor Chomsky is going to take a few questions. What we'd ask you to do, and to do this, please, as orderly as possible. I'm sure 1,000 of you probably have questions, and we will only be able to get to a few. But line up. We have 2 mics on either side, and we'll alternate. And Scott and I will be, manning the mics. And ask your question and try to be brief. And no speeches, please.
As I said, I can't really see too well, so if I miss somebody, make noise.
I haven't spoken with you in a few years. We were discussing Ramsey Clark when I was at Harvard and you at MIT. Your framing of the situation, your intellectual framing, I really question. It seems to be this is a time for action. Your presumption that this government is in some sense our government is something with which I completely disagree. At the time that we spoke, I said, we don't have a judicial system. It's a secretarial service for transnational corporations. And in the past 9 years, that situation has gotten far worse. Your time frame in terms of liberals want to have demonstrations and do things episodically. The powers that be continue their power and accelerate that power. Another issue that I have with you is the notion...
I didn't understand the issue.
Oh.
I mean, is there something you said that I disagree with?
Well, your presumption that, that human beings are one rational, that they evolve, that things, have the possibility. Perhaps there's a de-evolution occurring. Perhaps the problem is very massive. I'm a
I
person who...
agree that the problem's massive,
Yes,
but I also
I don't think that 9/11 is actually a significant event. I think that what's significant is the degree of horror that exists on a daily basis. 35,000 children a day die of starvation, HIV epidemic. The problems are in our civilizations. They're not 9/11. They're chronic problems.
Isn't that what I've been talking about for the last hour? I mean, I don't understand. I mean, if I understood, if you could
My
point to a
disagreement
disagreement,
with you
I could
is that I am very much disenchanted with the so-called liberal left. They like to come here and be amused by you, and I find that very offensive. I see us as in a very grave situation.
Well,
I don't see anything to laugh about, no, nothing.
I don't either. I think
And
it's
I
very
didn't
serious.
appreciate that paying $75 to hear you tonight.
Yeah, okay. I quite agree. What's needed is doing something. I agree with everything you're saying. What's needed is to do something. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Chomsky, a number of years ago, actually, is the microphone working? Okay.
Gotcha.
A number of years ago, I was introduced to a gentleman who was a career military person who ended up with a top security clearance at the Pentagon, working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. And he told me that the Gulf War was going to happen, and he said that one of the most interesting experiences that he had in being a file clerk, going in and out of meetings that were attended by the first George Bush, when he was vice president and a member of the National Security Council, was that they were planning a Gulf War, and...
You're talking about in the 80s now.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that the United States went and found some operatives in Israel that went into either Iran or Iraq and started shooting at the opposite side to initiate the war between Iran and Iraq, that then weakened both sides.
That was in 1980. I think that's very unlikely.
I can't hear you.
I think that's extreme. I mean, we don't have any evidence for that, and I think it's extremely unlikely. At the time of when the Iran-Iraq war started, Israel and the United States were trying to restore a regime in Iran very much like that of the Shah. We know that. That's when what's called the arms for hostage business, which is totally wrong name, actually began immediately after the fall of the Shah. Carter sent a NATO general, General Heuser, to Iran right after the fall of the Shah to try to stir up a military coup. That didn't work. And immediately after that, the U.S. started sending arms to Iran via Israel with Saudi Arabian funding, and the purpose was openly and publicly explained primarily by the Israelis involved, not much in the United States, but plenty in Europe and elsewhere. And it was pretty reasonable. What they said is, notice there were no hostages at the time, so it had nothing to do with hostages. The purpose, they said, was to try to find, well, as Uri Lubrani was sort of basically the Israeli ambassador to Iran under the Shah, not technically, as he put it over British television, the purpose was to find Iranian officers who would be willing to kill 10,000 people in the streets, and if they would be willing to do that, they'd be able to carry out a military coup and restore something like the Shah's regime. That's standard operating procedure. The standard way to try to overthrow a civilian government you don't like is to arm the military. That worked in Indonesia, it worked in Chile, it works quite frequently, and it's kind of like the reflex. As it turned out, it didn't work. A couple of years later, the Iranian government discovered the military officers who were involved, executed them. After that, you go into the next phase, which was sort of faked as arms for hostage deal. But all of this was going on right through the early years of the Iraqi invasion, which the U.S. backed, as did Britain and Russia and France and others. So I just don't believe that story. If some evidence comes out about it, okay, but it seems inconsistent with what we do know.
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening, Professor Chomsky. I've been listening to your speeches for over 12 years. I remember Gulf War I when I was just fed a line of bull from NPR and CBS. I didn't have television, fortunately, thank God. I had shortwave radio, so I was able to listen to people like Robert Fisk on BBC. And it was really you that, listening to a speech of yours back in 1990, that really crystallized my thought. I first thought you were just absolute maniac when I first heard you, but I had to really discipline my mind. It turned out everything that you said I knew was true, and it was a tremendous leap for me. But when I've seen this progression of time in the last 12 years, things have just gotten worse, not better. I'm speaking to you firstly as a person who's been unemployed for 1 year, got no medical insurance. I got a kid who's got a mental disability, and I'm just wondering, I've got colleagues of mine also out of work, and we get it, we really do, but we don't see any group or faction or whatever that we can identify with, that we can go ahead and push things forward towards a more positive tomorrow.
Any faction in the political system, you mean?
Not in the political system. I'm talking about what's called the left, the progressive or radical, or whichever name, you can call it libertarian socialism or whatever. I mean, even in your book here, you mentioned that in the reader here, when you interviewed with James Peck, you had trouble finding groups that you could identify with. And that's the same problem that people in my position are having too. So,
I just don't see the world that way. I think everything you're saying is right, but I think there are plenty of things to identify with. In fact, the opportunities for organizing and activism now are better than any time I can remember in my lifetime.
But the people I work with...
And there are movements. There are very significant movements.
Right,
the global justice movements, for example.
Right. But the people I work with
are something new in human history.
But the people I work with, while we get it, we're Joe Six-Packs, we watch TV every night,
maybe some people do, but plenty of people don't. There's activism and organizing going all over the place.
I agree.
70,000 people didn't get to Porto Alegre last February because they were watching TV.
Oh, I agree, but...
there's nothing like that has ever happened before. This is the first time that there has ever been a large... of course, they don't represent just 70,000 people. They represent millions of people from around the world, from every walk of life you can think of. Campesinos, working people, environmentalists, whatever you like. People who've had never had anything to do with each other in the past from all over the world. It's the first seeds of what might be the first genuine international in history. What the labor movement and the left have always been looking forward to. It's never happened before. That's really significant, and it's not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of intensive organizing, dedicated activism, not only all over this country, but much more so over much of the South and Europe and many parts of the world.
Do you think we can make it in 30 years? Because it looks like...
I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you know? If you had asked, in the 18th century, can we ever make it in overthrowing slavery and feudalism? Who knows? Certainly not by just speculating about it.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, first of all. I was a little perplexed, and maybe I shouldn't have been, by the recent vote in Congress on the resolution, at the lack of dissent, I guess maybe especially in the Democrats. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on just what is going on there.
Yeah. Well, I'd suggest looking over a stretch of time. So, it's shameful that 23 people voted against it. But have a look back a little. Take a look, say, at 1964, when the opposite side of the political spectrum was in power, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. In Tonkin, even if you believed what the government said about Tonkin Gulf, didn't amount to anything, and in fact it was fabricated. But let's believe it. Suppose people were voting on the basis of what they believed at the time. What they claimed at the time was there had been an attack on a destroyer off the coast of North Vietnam. How many people voted against the resolution basically for a war, to expand the war against Vietnam? 2. Okay, and nothing was happening then. I mean, this time at least they can make some kind of a claim, like September 11 did happen. And that's improvement. You know, I'd like it to be faster, obviously, so would we all. But it's going to get that way by 2 things. By trying to understand something about the world and by acting. And you can't act sensibly without understanding.
I have a 2-part question. It's a little bit abstract, but I'm going to be as fast as possible so as not to waste your time. Many of those who would justify violent intervention on the part of the U.S. would use, say, World War II as a paradigm example of a time when it seems like that kind of intervention was somehow justified. And my question is, if either World War II or some other instance is an example of justifiable intervention, what criteria can we use to know whether or not that intervention is justifiable? And if you don't believe any type of intervention is justifiable, then how would you justify or explain away the possibility of a Nazi Europe, which somehow seems even worse than the consequences of our intervention?
Well, first of all, World War II can't be an example of justified intervention because there was no intervention. I mean, you can't have an example unless it happened. Nobody intervened anywhere. I mean, the U.S. didn't go to war until a couple of its colonies were bombed. That's not intervention. Germany declared war on the United States. You know? So there's no intervention. I mean, maybe you can decide whether it was the right or wrong thing to do, but it wasn't intervention, so therefore it can't be an example. Furthermore, even if you ask me, I mean, when I was a kid of 12 years old and 15 years old, I had basically the same beliefs I have now. You know, maybe it's not a compliment, but I thought we should have gone to war. In fact, I thought we should have gone to war much earlier. And in retrospect, I still think so. That is, I think there should have been intervention, even though there wasn't. Okay.
Could you just explain what criteria you might use to know when a situation?
Because Hitler was a real danger to the world, terrific danger to the world. At that time, first of all, I didn't even think intervention was necessary. And in fact, in retrospect, that's probably true. Remember that the U.S. and Britain were giving not so tacit support to fascism. Mussolini, for example, was welcomed. U.S. investment in Italy just skyrocketed. When Mussolini took over, he was what Roosevelt called that admirable Italian gentleman, and Roosevelt's admiration for him continued up till 1939. He still said fascism is a good, serious experiment. I mean, unfortunately, Mussolini was misled by Hitler. The State Department was praising the massive atrocities in Abyssinia and talking about Mussolini's astonishing achievements. As far as Hitler was concerned, State Department at least, you know, we know something about. This is one of the good things about this country. Best things is it's a free country. It's a pretty open society by world standards. We can learn a lot about it if we want to. Okay. One of the things we can learn is that at least as late as 1937, the State Department, European branch of the State Department, was describing Hitler as a moderate who was standing between the extremes of right and left and who we have to support, or else, I'm virtually quoting, the masses joined by the disillusioned middle classes will move to the left, and that we obviously can't expect. He's not the first person who's been described as a moderate standing between the extremes of right and left. Same was true of Saddam Hussein by Reagan's National Security Council in, say, right and left, but he was described as a moderate. So the U.S. basically gave enough tacit support to Franco's Spain, so they were able to, so that fascism was able to take over there. Britain's record was much worse, incidentally. I think if those acts hadn't taken, they're called appeasement, but that's misleading. These were acts understood to be in the national interest as usually construed, the interests of powerful domestic sectors. And from some point of view, that was correct. And it's because of that that the fascist danger did spread. And I think that had intervention taken place, which it didn't, it would have been justified, but probably unnecessary. Might have been enough not to lend support. When is intervention justified? You know, there's no general criteria for that. For example, I mean, let's take what almost universal U.S. Intellectual opinion accepts right now. It's universally accepted almost that the war in Afghanistan, the bombing of Afghanistan, was a just war. Okay, huge literature on that. Then there's a debate about whether the attack on Iraq will be a just war. Well, let's just take a look at the bombing of Afghanistan. I mean, that was undertaken. The war aim wasn't to overthrow the Taliban. That was an afterthought. The war aim, announced very openly by George Bush a couple days after the bombing started, was he said, we are told the Afghan people, we're going to bomb you until you turn over to us people who we believe might have been implicated in the atrocities of September 11th, but when they were asked to provide evidence, they said, we're not going to provide any evidence, just turn them over, period. Okay, that's considered a just war. If that's a just war, why doesn't Cuba or Nicaragua or a long list of other people have a right to bomb the United States? Okay. Well, we could go on with Iraq, but let's just take what everyone says is a clear case. The point is, when you talk about the right of intervention or just war or any of these notions, there is a fundamental principle, so elementary that nobody even bothers to mention it. It's called universality, right? It means if something's right for us, it's right for others. If it's wrong for them, it's wrong for us. And that holds of personal life and international affairs. So without answering your question, just let me say that any answer that you or anyone else can think of has to meet that criterion. Okay? Has to meet the criterion that if it's right for us to do, it's right for others to do. You just try out that criterion and look at the conclusions that are going to come. Okay? I mean, they're really unthinkable. Well, if they're unthinkable, there's got to be something wrong with the way we're approaching it. And I think we ought to pay some attention to that. So yes, there might be just criteria for just intervention. I think it's very hard to find examples. I mean, maybe you can do better than me. I've done a lot of research on this. I cannot find examples of genuine humanitarian intervention. I mean, everything's called humanitarian intervention by everybody, including Hitler and, who did in fact call it that. But can you find a real example? I mean, about the closest examples I can think of are in the 1970s. It's interesting that the 1990s are called the decade of humanitarian intervention in which the grand new norms were developed and so on. I don't think you can find a case of it in the 1990s, but you can find some cases in the 70s. So why aren't the 1970s called the decade of humanitarian intervention? Well, there's a reason for that. The 1970s began with an Indian invasion of what was then East Pakistan, which did put an end to the massacre of millions of people. And then the Indians withdrew. Okay, they didn't do it for humanitarian reasons, but certainly the consequences were humanitarian overwhelmingly. The decade ended with an invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam, which put an end to the atrocities of Pol Pot right at the moment when they were peaking. They were getting much worse in the 1980s, in 1978. That's when the piles of skulls are from, and 12 slain and all that stuff. That was 78. The Vietnamese invaded and put an end to it. Okay, so why I don't think it was for humanitarian ends, but it doesn't matter. It certainly had humanitarian effects. So why isn't that the decade of humanitarian intervention? There's nothing comparable to that in the 90s. There's a very simple reason. It was carried out by the wrong people. And furthermore, the U.S. opposed both of them. Practically went to war with it, threatened the war with India, sent a nuclear carrier into the Bay of Bengal to threaten the Indians. In the case of Vietnam, the U.S. Bitterly condemned the Vietnamese overthrow of Pol Pot, turned immediately to the support of Pol Pot, both diplomatically and militarily, and the support of the Chinese invasion to punish the Vietnamese for the crime of overthrowing Pol Pot. Okay, so those things can't count. But can't they? I mean, can you think of any better example? The trouble with this discussion is it's all off in outer space somewhere. I mean, it doesn't even begin to meet the most elementary criteria, like universality, and the description of the facts is just wildly wrong. including World War II, which wasn't an intervention and forgets the background, and the cases since. If we want to be serious about it, it's a serious question. I think you're raising a very serious question. We want to be serious about it, we have to start by at least getting the facts straight. And second, we have to be willing to accept the criterion of universality. And if we can't go that far, we should at least have the decency not even to talk about it. Okay? And if that happens, you will discover, try it for yourself, that the entire discussion of just war disappears. You know, save a lot of forests that way by just meeting those simple criteria. That doesn't answer your question. It's a hard question.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for coming, sir, and it's an honor to talk to you. I've read several of your books, and I'm very impressed with all of them. I'll try to be as brief as possible, sir. First of all, do you believe that the timing of the North Koreans announcing that they have nuclear weapons...
The timing of...
I'm sorry. The timing of North Korea announcing that they have nuclear weapons is suspicious? And number two, do you believe that if Lula is elected in Brazil, that it will send a message to the neoconservatives that the people, especially in Latin America, are tired of the nonsense what's going on with the IMF, the World Bank? They're just tired of it. And the third question is, do you believe that our militarism is just a symptom of the violence in our society today? I'm sorry.
I couldn't hear the third one. I didn't get the third one.
Okay, the third question is, sir, do you believe with our militarism that's going on is just a symptom of our violence in society? Can you connect the dots? And
Okay.
I'll hang up and listen.
Yeah. Well, you know, the fact about the North Korean case, I mean, I don't know any more about it than you do. You know, I mean, in fact, we know very little. I suspect, if you want just a guess, that the North Koreans announced it because there was an intelligence discovery, and that intelligence discovery might have been a long time ago. I mean, I'm not too surprised to hear about it, frankly. But the fact is that many countries in the world are undoubtedly pursuing the development of weapons of mass destruction because they need a deterrent. And they need a deterrent against the United States. And that's not just my opinion, it's a standard opinion. And so you can read in the most respectable professional literature by leading international relations specialists, so Kenneth Waltz to take one of the founders of realist international relations theory and a serious guy, that the U.S. is forcing countries into proliferation because they know that the U.S. can't be deterred with conventional forces. So they only have two options. He only mentioned one of them. One is development of weapons of mass destruction, and the second is turning to terrorism. What other deterrent is there? Especially after the U.S. has openly announced, and in fact for a long time has been pursuing, the intention of world domination through military superiority. Quote Anatol Yevin again. And these aren't my views. These are very mainstream views, and for very simple and accurate reasons. You know, that's correct. So I suppose North Korea is doing it, probably as a deterrent. They're not going to attack anybody. And why they decided to announce it now, you know, who knows? Maybe, you know, there was an intelligence discovery that was going to be made public, and probably they just want some deal in which will end up with more aid. I mean, I think we ought to follow the lead of South Korea on this. That was what would make sense. And the U.S. has been, I mean, Clinton was sort of doing it, but Bush has undercut it. On Lula, I don't think the IMF and the World Bank have to wait for the election to know that the world doesn't like what they're doing. You know, they know it. They know it very well. All you have to do is look at polls in Latin America and you see it. Lula is a particular important phenomenon. Brazil's a very important country, and it has he's a impressive figure. I've met him a couple of times. I think he really is impressive. An important background, but more important than any individual, Brazil has a very, the Workers' Party, which he comes out of and sort of founded, is far and away the most important kind of labor-based social democratic party in the world. There's nothing that comes close. And there are popular movements which are just spectacular, like the landless workers movement and others, and tremendous ferment in the country. And what happens in Brazil makes a big difference in the hemisphere. Well, in fact, in the world economy, it's an important place. In the last couple of years, it's been following sort of an IMF program, the Cardozo program, which has had a very harmful effect on the economy and the society. I mean, it has cut back inflation, but it's done it by raising interest rates so high that it sharply cuts back growth. A lot of capital flowing in and out, but that's dangerous and harmful. There's a big debt, mostly domestic, and the question is, will they cancel it? The IMF, they sort of gave up on whether, for years they've been trying to keep Lula out. You know, probably would have won earlier elections if there'd been any fair shot at it. This time they figure they can let him come in because they think they got a stranglehold, and they may be right. Brazil needed a loan to cover debts. They got an IMF loan, but I'm sure you know the way it was given. It was given with a condition. The money is withheld until after the election, and the condition is that the new president, presumably Lula, will have to follow essentially the same rules, meaning continue the same policies. Well, they're doing this because they know that people don't like it, and they understand why people don't like it. I mean, these policies have been extremely harmful throughout most of the world. All you have to do is look at macroeconomic statistics, you know, rate of growth of the economy, rate of growth of productivity, investment. I mean, almost any measure you take has declined in the so-called neoliberal years since, you know, the early 70s when the whole system was dismantled. It's true in the United States as well. I mean, I just looked at some of the latest census figures. I mean, even if you count in this brief growth spurt in the late 1990s, even if you count that in, this is from memory, so maybe I won't have it exactly straight, but something like this. The median real wages, I think it is, for males is still below what it was in 1979. Well, that's 20 years of stagnation. It rose some for women, and totally there's a slight rise in 20 years, but that's basically stagnation. The poverty level's about what it was in 79. People are working way harder than they were in 79 just to keep things going, as you know, months a year of extra work for an average family. And benefits have collapsed. You know, a lot of bad things have happened. If you compare that with the preceding period, you know, when the Bretton Woods rules were in operation up to the early 70s, I mean, that was a period of unparalleled economic growth. Nothing like it in history, and it was also egalitarian. And it was combined with, you know, sort of what we call welfare state measures. It's not just the United States. That's pretty much a worldwide phenomenon, particularly harsh in places like Latin America. The only places where this didn't happen are the countries that didn't follow the rules. East Asia didn't follow the rules, and you know, things happen. I mean, it's not the whole story. There's plenty of other things, but that's a rough picture, and surely the World Bank and the IMF know it perfectly well. They don't have to wait for the election to find out, and they don't, you know, they're not identical, but the IMF at least doesn't, which is sort of like an offshoot of the Treasury Department, they don't want that to happen. In fact, you know, well-known conservative economists just talk about what they call the IMF Treasury Wall Street complex. Jagdish Bhagwati. So yeah, they know, you know, and they're trying to control it. Whether it will happen or not, it's a big issue. As to tying up the violence inside American society with the international violence, I'm not so convinced you can connect the dots. First of all, the violence inside the United States we have to be a little cautious about. I mean, if you take a look at, say, crime rates, the United States isn't off the spectrum. It's within the spectrum of industrial societies, kind of toward the high end, but you know, not off the spectrum. The one exception to this is deaths from guns. Okay, but that's because of the crazed gun culture. You know, it doesn't have to do with violence in the society. So I think we have to be a little cautious. I mean, what is different between the United States and other industrial societies is fear of crime and incarceration. Punishment for crime and fear of crime are much higher here than in comparable societies, but not crime itself. And yes, there's way too much violence, but it's maybe more here than in other places, but it's not so obvious. And I doubt that it has any real connection with international violence. Like most of the people in the country don't want international violence. No, people are peaceful. They don't want to go to war. They don't like war. They have to be driven into it. They have to be forced into it by fear and propaganda. That's why there's such major efforts made to terrify people. About the Sandinistas and Gaddafi and Arabs and terrorists and criminals and Iraq at this moment, but not some other moment, and so on. Because you just have to drive people into war. They're not violent. So I'm not convinced that one can connect the dots. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for coming to Yavish, Dr. Chomsky. Iran is one of the three countries on President Bush's axis of evil. And I read a recent interview with you explaining U.S. policy towards Iran. I think you made a brilliant point, and that was comparing the policy towards Iran with what mafia bosses do to people who step out of the line, and how mafia bosses there's a special way that mafia bosses treat people who disobey them, and you compare that to what U.S. is doing towards some countries, including Iran. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and
let me see if I caught you correct, because I couldn't understand all the question about U.S. policy toward Iran and how that's related to disobedience, basically.
And one point that you mentioned was a reference you made to mafia.
To the mafia?
To the mafia.
Oh, yeah, I understand.
And this was a recent interview that you did, and I was wondering.
Okay, I remember. Yeah, I remember the context. Yeah. So how does that fit in?
And if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I understand. The U.S. policy toward Iran, I'm sure you know the main story, but Iran did try to take control of its own resources back in 1953 under a conservative nationalist. And that was overthrown by a U.S. British-backed military coup, which installed the Shah and came, a quarter century of torture and brutality and, so on. Ultimately, the revolution of '79, at which point Iran became disobedient. If you take a look at the record through the period of the Shah, a horrifying human rights record, he was always right at the top for Amnesty International. There was virtually no discussion of it, no problems at that time. When Jimmy Carter, the latest Nobel Prize winner, showed up, I think it was, January '78 or sometime like around then, he praised the Shah, for his munificence and said how happy he was to see how much his people loved him and so on and so forth. And he wasn't out of line. That was the standard view. 1979, well, I sort of mentioned already, the immediate step was to try to restore the original. Didn't work. Ever since then, Iran's been disobedient. It's part of the axis of evil. It's very likely that the war against Iran is already underway. Iraq is, you got to think a little ahead. The attack on Iraq is part of a much broader geopolitical strategy, bits and pieces of which have been let out. Iran is a much bigger target. Israel, which is by now essentially an offshore U.S. military base, that's literally the case, is, we think of as, if you believe what the Israeli army and its analysts say, and I don't see any reason not to, they claim that Israel now has larger and more advanced air and naval forces than any NATO power. except for the U.S. About 12% of them are supposed to be permanently stationed in eastern Turkey. That means in these big U.S. air bases in eastern Turkey, where planes are flying, probably nuclear armed. And the Israeli Air Force is supposed to be flying, they say, flying planes across the Iranian border. I mean, they don't care that much about Iraq. They figure that's going to get knocked over. Iran's a much bigger target. And they're probably going after that. According to the specialist literature in the United States, there's an effort underway to, just the academic literature, there's an effort underway to split Iran up, to encourage Azeri nationalism, to get them to take the northern part and incorporate into Azerbaijan and create, in part of a big alliance of U.S., Israel, Turkey, Azerbaijan's a small player, which will cut Iran off from, the sea, Caspian Sea, and break it up maybe. Those are long-term plans. I'm sure Iran is perfectly well aware of them. I mean, they can read the same American journals I can, and they know more than that. So yeah, I think that's a long-term plan. The question is why? I mean, in this case, as far as we know, the U.S. energy corporations aren't in favor of it. This looks like state policy. And here's where the mafia analogy comes in. Europe is trying to, doesn't like it. As far as I know, American oil companies don't like it. But the state is pursuing it. And I think it's pursuing it for a reason which is pretty common. It's what's called in the international relations literature credibility, establishing credibility. So like when Blair and Clinton talked about the need to bomb Serbia, they gave fake reasons, but the actual reason, which they kept coming back to, and which is in retrospect, they repeat in testimony to Congress, is you got to establish what they call the credibility of NATO. Okay, when they talk about the credibility of NATO, they don't mean Belgium. That means the credibility of the United States. Okay, now what's credibility? Well, here you turn to your mafia don. You want to know what credibility is, ask the nearest mafia don. I mean, if somebody doesn't pay protection money in your area, you don't get a court order to go after the money, even if you could get it. And the reason is that would lose credibility. What you do is send in some goons and beat them to a pulp. That establishes credibility. Then other people know what happens if you get out of line. And that international affairs unfortunately run kind of like the mafia. And this notion of establishing credibility is very significant. It shows up all over the place. You've got to show people they cannot step out of line. There's things I was reading from the declassified record about Cuba 40 years ago. That's mostly about establishing credibility. It was the successful defiance of the United States and its century-and-a-half-old policy of running the hemisphere that's intolerable, quite apart from stimulating others to duplicate it, being a model for others. But just the undermining credibility, meaning others might feel I can get away with it too, that's not acceptable if you want to run, anything, whether it's a local territory for a mafia don or the world. In fact, you find the same thing in families. You take a really abusive patriarchal family, a lot of what goes on is establishing credibility. You got to know what orders to follow. These are things we're all familiar with, unfortunately, and it works for international affairs too. And I think that's a large part of what's going on with Iran. Otherwise there's no particular plausibility behind the program of not supporting reformist elements who are trying to democratize the country and reintegrate it into the international system, which the U.S. is blocking. So we don't have, a lot of this is speculation. We don't have internal records from the recent period, but it seems to me to fit the general pattern.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I'd like to ask you a question about someone who seems to be one of your personal heroes, and I hear from some sources that you have a large picture of him in your office. Bertrand Russell, son of Lord Russell of the British Empire. So just I think a couple of Russell quotes are quite relevant to the current times. This is Russell in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1946. He says, "It is entirely clear that there is only one way in which the great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly on serious armed force. An international government must have whatever is necessary to make it irresistible. The international authority must have a monopoly of uranium and of whatever other raw materials may hereafter be found to be suitable for the manufacture of atomic bombs. It must have a large army of inspectors who must have the right to enter any factory without notice. Any attempt to interfere with them or obstruct their work must be treated as casus belli." And it's to be bound by Constitution to intervene by force of arms against any...
I can add plenty of horrible comments by Russell, but what's your point?
Okay, there's another thing I'd like to...
if you want, I can tell you all kind of things that Russell said, racist, genocidal,
that
sexist,
kind of stuff.
and so on and so forth. But what's the point?
Well, and the fact that he advocated a preemptive war.
He advocated a lot of horrible things. What is your point?
Right. The question is, why? Do you continue to respect this man? If so,
I respect him for a lot of the things that he did. You started by saying he's my hero. He's not my hero. Nobody should be anybody's hero. On the other hand, he has quite a respectable record. This is somebody who, was jailed during World War I because he dared to say that there was something wrong with the war. He fought for rights of women, for progressive education. He stood up for things that almost nobody was willing to say in the 50s and the 60s. In his 80s, he was out there demonstrating in the streets against the war in Vietnam and for disarmament. He has a lot of, aside from the fact that he was a very important figure in 20th century intellectual life, and all of those things I do respect.
I understand that, but it seems
so what's your question?
Okay, well, it seems to me that like the stuff that's good about him is kind of a lacing over of, it's kind of like trickery, basically.
Trickery? No, it wasn't trickery. He was a human being. He did a lot of wonderful things. He had a lot of failings. So what?
But
you know any human being who isn't like that?
Why don't you tell your readers the whole truth about Russell?
Pardon?
Why don't you inform your readers about the whole truth about Russell?
I do it all the time. I just did it.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. It's your belief that he's a hero, not mine. I think he's a person who did a lot of admirable things, and I think we should stand up for those things.
Professor Chomsky, in many of your books, you talk about the repression that the United States enacts on other countries across the world. After 9/11, with the Patriot Act and Homeland Security being established by Bush, and it seems that the federal government is expanding its powers. Do you see any threat to the personal freedom or freedom of speech for American citizens after 9/11?
Well, look, if John Ashcroft had his way, I hate to think what we'd be living under. I don't think they're going to succeed in that. What's happened in the area of civil liberties, some of it is totally disgraceful, and it's been directed, as you'd expect, against more vulnerable populations. Like, for example, what's happening in Guantanamo is totally unspeakable. That violates not only U.S. law, but every international humanitarian law. It tears to shreds the Geneva Conventions, apart from which a stolen piece of Cuba. But, that's grotesque. And what's been happening to immigrants is extremely ugly. And what's been happening to other vulnerable people isn't very pretty either. But they have not come anywhere near achieving any restrictions on freedom of speech. They'd like to, but it hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened, I think, because the victories of popular struggle over past years, including the past several decades, have just embedded these notions into people's understanding and consciousness, and they're not going to give them up easily. We think of freedom of speech as something that's, you're taught in school that it comes in the Bill of Rights. It doesn't. I mean, the U.S. didn't have real guarantees for freedom of speech until the 1960s, court guarantees. It was in the 1960s, in the course of the civil rights movement, that the Supreme Court finally gave a strong endorsement of freedom of speech, and then another later in the 1960s. Those are reflections of things that were happening in the country. But I think the things that happened are real. I don't think people are going to give up those rights easily. And while there's a lot of complaining about this and that, the fact of the matter is that the rights of freedom of speech and other rights for a very large part of the population have been defended, and I think will be defended. That doesn't justify what has happened, and it doesn't mean we should tolerate it. Nobody should tolerate, for example, what's going on in Guantanamo. The major thrust of the Patriot Act, although on paper it looks pretty awful, has not been implemented, and I don't think will be. But that's up to us to determine.
Dr. Chomsky, in light of your compelling argument this evening, had you been president on September 11th, 2001, what would your response have been?
Well, I really can't answer that. What should have happened? I mean, I think what the right response to it's a major criminal act, crime against humanity. I think the right reaction to a criminal action, no matter what it is, small or large, is to try to identify the perpetrators. Okay? Once you've done that, try to bring them to justice. If it requires force and it's an international affair, get Security Council authorization for doing it, bringing them to justice. If you can, once you apprehend them, bring them to a fair international tribunal where they'll get a fair trial. That's what should be done. It should not only be done in the case of 9/11, but also in the case of far worse terrorist acts, like the ones that I was describing, which trace back to Washington. That's the right way to do it. What's the wrong way to do it? Well, the wrong way to do it is to decide I'm going to bomb somebody, and I think maybe you guys in Afghanistan are holding the perpetrators, but I have no evidence for it. And notice that as late as 8 months later, 8 months after the bombing, when the head of the FBI testified before the Senate Investigating Committee, the most that he could say is, this is 8 months later, that we now believe that the plot may have been hatched in Afghanistan, but was implemented in Germany and the Gulf region. Okay, on that basis, you bomb Afghanistan? I don't think that's the right way, and I don't think on the principle of universality we'd ever tolerate that for a minute if it was directed against the West. What about bombing a country because they refuse to hand somebody over to you that who you think might be involved in terrorism? Is that right? I mean, is it right for Haiti to bomb the United States? It's a fair example. In fact, right in the middle of all of this, September 30th, Haiti didn't initiate it, renewed its request for extradition for Emmanuel Constant, who's the head of the paramilitary terrorist organization that killed a couple of thousand people in the early 90s with not so tacit U.S. support from Bush and Clinton. They'd already tried. There's no doubt of what he was involved in. You don't have to believe it like they now believe about Afghanistan. They know it. He's been tried in absentia, but they want to try him directly. Not only did the U.S. refuse, and they're asking for formal extradition, not just hand him over and I'm not going to give you any evidence. Okay. Well, the U.S. not only didn't hand him over, they didn't even respond. And, it's barely even mentioned in the press. Who cares? Kill a couple thousand black people in Haiti with our help. Who cares? Does that entitle Haiti to set off bombs in the U.S.? I don't think so. I don't know anybody who thinks so. It'd be outrageous. So why is this okay? Well, I think what should have been done is something along the lines of what I suggested. Incidentally, it wasn't my idea particularly. I was quoting the leading Anglo-American military historian, Michael Howard, highly respected figure, very conservative. Thinks the British Empire was wonderful and the American Empire is even better. This is from Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal. said the same thing a couple months earlier. And I think that's kind of a reasonable way to deal with terrible crimes. But there was never any thought of that. And in fact, notice that would anyone accept that if it was done to us? Even that. If anybody mentioned it, they'd be sent to the nearest lunatic asylum. And in fact, if anybody tried to do it, the U.S. would invoke what in Europe is now often called the Netherlands Invasion Act. I don't know if you followed this, but over the summer, Congress passed and the President signed legislation which authorizes the President to use force to rescue any American who's brought to The Hague on charges of international criminal action. Okay, Netherlands Invasion Act. That's how extreme the position here is. But if anyone were to suggest any judicial proceeding for American leaders who are clearly implicated in very serious terrorist acts, I ran through a lot of it, just one case from their own record. You go to other cases even worse. Would anybody even dream of that? Well, then why do we dream of it for others? Actually, I think we should dream of it for all of them, but that's a long way to go. So, there were ways to respond. And in fact, notice that those ways were followed. The successes, there have been successes in dismantling Al-Qaeda-like cells, and they've been mostly in Europe. There was a big one in Germany a couple of weeks ago where police work did dismantle a very substantial cell. Okay, that's the way to do it. And those or disrupt finances. Those are the things to do.
Thank you for coming, Professor Chomsky. I've been an activist for a number of years in the war against the users of some drugs. And with the passage of the Patriot Act and with all this stuff coming up against the war on terrorism, recently they've been trying to paint the war on drugs as people who use drugs are terrorists. And I'd kind of like you to comment on this a little bit.
Well, substances, drugs is a funny word, but there are harmful substances. One of them, in fact, is a white powder. There's one white powder, which is by far the most lethal known. It's called sugar. It's not a joke, incidentally. And in fact, if you look at the history of imperialism, a lot of it has to do with it. A lot of the imperial conquests, say in the Caribbean, set up a kind of a network. The Caribbean back in the 17th and 18th century was a soft drug producer. Sugar, rum, tobacco, chocolate. And in order to do it, they had to enslave Africans. And it was done largely to pacify working people in England who were being driven into, awful circumstances by the early Industrial Revolution. That's why so many wars took place around the Caribbean. And sugar was one main part of it, and other soft drugs. If you take other substances, it's not the substances themselves, it's the way they're processed, but let's overlook that. Like tobacco, the plant doesn't harm anybody. But tobacco is, with that qualification, is by far the most lethal substance known, apart from things like sugar and stuff like that. Nobody suggests that people who smoke should be put in jail. And nobody says that, say, China has a right to bomb Kentucky and North Carolina because we're not only exporting those lethal drugs to the substances to them, which are killing millions of people, but we're even forcing them to run advertising for them. Like the Colombian cartel isn't permitted to put ads on TV saying how great it would be to, shoot this stuff up.
I have an internet radio station where I play a lot of your stuff. Can I give you my card?
Yeah, sure. These are real problems. Tobacco's a problem, right? And in fact, we know how to deal with it. And in fact, there are successes in dealing with it. I mean, I haven't seen a student in my office smoking a cigarette in probably 15 years, unless it's European. And that was not because of criminalization. It was not because of criminalization, it was because of education. I mean, throughout the 1980s, particularly, this had a lot to do with the war on drugs. Through the 1980s, there was a decline among relatively educated people, like, say, people who are likely to go to college. There was a decline in the use of all kinds of harmful substances. Hard drugs, soft drugs, tobacco, alcohol, red meat, all kinds of things declined. And that was part of, people picking up a healthier lifestyle. And yeah, that's the way to do it. In fact, it has a lot to do with the war on drugs. One of the, as sort of mentioned in my talk, Moynihan is not my favorite person in the world, but he is the one senator who paid some attention to social statistics. And when the latest phase of the war on drugs was called in the late 80s, he pointed out that if we pass this legislation, we're declaring a crime wave among minorities. Okay, and the reason was, if you look at the trend lines among, there's a real close race-class correlation in the United States. It's not perfect, but close. Among sort of roughly more educated sectors, use of things like drugs was declining. When it had peaked, like in 1979, you didn't throw a lot of people into jail because those were children of wealthy people or executives going home to their homes, and you don't throw those people into jail. But as it declined through the 80s and remained sort of steady among poorer sections of the population, at that point, if you declare a drug war, you're criminalizing the poor. And that's what happened. It's not accidental that the number of people the number of black males in jail is shot way up for victimless crimes, like your kid is caught with a joint in his pocket in downtown or something. Yeah, that was planned. And furthermore, the criminologists are well aware of it. You look at the criminology literature, mainstream, they point this out. So it's, in fact, a lot of these criminalization campaigns way back really have to do with what's called controlling the dangerous classes. That was same was true of prohibition and other things. And why was marijuana criminalized? A large part of the reason was it was smoked by Mexicans and by blacks in Harlem. And, when the prohibition was over and the Bureau of Narcotics had nothing to do, they hit on marijuana, not for any medical reason. And a lot of the history of prohibition is like this. In fact, if you look at the just mainstream criminology literature, it's called controlling the dangerous classes. And yeah, I think that's what the war on drugs is about. It has nothing to do with helping people who have drug problems. You want to do that, the way to do it is prevention through educational programs and treatment. And that works. Actually, one of the good things that Nixon did was put money into that, and it worked. The new programs don't do that because they're not trying to deal with the problem. They're trying to do something else. Chemical warfare in Colombia is outrageous. It would be like China bombing North Carolina. And what it's doing is driving peasants off the land, which will then be taken over by mining companies that will strip mine and agribusiness for monoculture, agri-export, and so on. The whole idea is outrageous in the first place, but the way it's implemented is just destroying people's lives.
Thank you.
And the same is true domestically.
I too would like to thank you for being here this evening. My question is, in light of our government's recent efforts to prepare public opinion for this war against Iraq or terrorism, how would you interpret Jerry Falwell's recent commentary on the Prophet of Islam as being a terrorist?
How would I interpret?
Jerry Falwell's recent commentary on the Prophet of Islam as being a terrorist.
Falwell?
Right.
Jerry Falwell, you're saying? Yeah. Beneath the level on which comment is necessary, I think. I'm sure I'd say exactly what you would.
Thank you for coming tonight. As a recovering...
I mean, actually, if anybody's serious about that, I don't know if they are. But if, I mean, you know, if, for example, you know, if take any country that has laws against hate crimes, inspiring hatred and genocide and so on, I mean, the first thing they would do is ban the Old Testament, you know, which is far and away the most, I mean, there's nothing like it in the literary canon that exalts genocide to that extent. And it's not a joke either. That's, you know, like where I live, New England, the people who liberated it from the native scourge were religious fundamentalist lunatics who came waving the holy book, declaring themselves to be the children of Israel who are killing the Amalekites like God told them. You know, that goes for a long time.
Thank you for coming this evening. As a recovering sugar addict, I'm happy to have you speak on that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
I was just wondering if you could comment on the comparison where Bush is demanding Saddam Hussein's attention to UN resolutions and our assistance with Israel, you know, defying UN resolutions against Palestinian occupation.
I mean, the comparison is correct. Israel's in violation of many more resolutions. But all of that discussion, which I'm glad people are carrying it out, but it's missing a certain crucial point. I mean, the major way to violate a UN Security Council resolution is to veto it, right? Like if Iraq had the power to veto resolutions, it wouldn't be in violation of anything, okay? So if you want to really look at violations of resolutions, you got to count in the veto, okay? Well, here the history is interesting, and it should be known to people in elementary school. After the early days of the United Nations, you know, it's just run by the United States for perfectly obvious reasons having to do with the post-war period. But through the 50s and the 60s, decolonization set in. The UN had a broader representation, other parts of the world reconstructed. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. was not able to run the UN any longer. Okay, since that time, the U.S. is way in the lead in vetoes. Britain is second, and nobody else is even close. Well, every one of those vetoes is a violation of a Security Council resolution, you know. And it's not just supporting Israel. I mean, like I mentioned before, the U.S. vetoed a resolution calling on all states to observe international law. That had nothing to do with Israel, you know. And there's all kinds of issues. So yeah, there's plenty of violation of Security Council resolutions, and the worst offenders are the vetoers, like us, which happen to be us. These are things everybody ought to know. You know, it's really important. And if you look at the list, you'll see it's not a small thing. Those who defend Israel's violation point out correctly that the resolutions aren't what are called Chapter 7 resolutions. Chapter 7 resolutions in the UN are ones that authorize the use of force or might authorize the use of force. It's not Chapter 7 doesn't authorize force. And none of the ones against Israel are Chapter 7, but that's a very weak defense. There's a reason for that. I mean, if anyone tried to make a Chapter 7 resolution, the U.S. wouldn't let it get past the first day of discussion, you know. So that's why they're not Chapter 7. But since the U.S. essentially took Israel over as an outpost, military outpost, which is what it amounts to, it's been treating it that way, you know, like a part of the U.S. Strategic system. So the U.S. has been blocking a diplomatic settlement of that conflict for 25 years, still is. Not just vetoing resolutions, and in fact there are cases where the U.S. has actually voted with the majority, but purely cynically. Like the U.S. has repeatedly voted joined in unanimous resolutions, ordering Israel to stop flagrant violations, as they're called, of the Fourth Geneva Convention. I mean, if the Fourth Geneva Convention were lived up to, everything the U.S., just about everything the U.S. and Israel are doing in the occupied territories would be out. And the U.S. has voted for those resolutions a number of times, but it continues to violate them. You know, Israel can't do a thing in the occupied territories unless the U.S. authorizes it, in fact pays for it indirectly. So yeah, Carter and Bush #1 voted for such resolutions, but that's pure cynicism. Clinton, at least, was honest. He essentially abrogated international law. The Clinton administration declared at the UN that UN resolutions and their phrase was obsolete and anachronistic in the case of Israel. So we just abrogate the whole thing. And when the Geneva Conventions came up under Clinton, it was October 2000, there was a unanimous, the U.S. abstained for the first time on an otherwise unanimous resolution, October 2000, calling on Israel to observe the Fourth Geneva Convention. Bush went further. Last December, Switzerland, which is, you know, the repository of responsible for the Geneva Conventions, called a conference of what are called the high contracting parties, the parties that are legally obligated by treaty to enforce it. 114 showed up, including the whole European Union, even including England, and they passed a strong resolution condemning grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, including illegal settlements and a whole list of other things. Bush boycotted it. Okay. When the U.S. boycotts something or vetoes it, it's double. Boycotting it, first of all, kills it, just like a veto does, but it also excludes it from discussion. So there was almost no mention of this in the United States. Under the Geneva Conventions, high contracting parties like the United States are bound to enforce them. That is, to prosecute anyone who's involved in breaches of them, and grave breaches are war crimes under U.S. law, meaning the U.S. is obligated by solemn treaty to prosecute its own leadership. But nobody talks about this any more than anyone talks about universality in the just war case. And that's serious. That includes virtually everything that's going on in the territories, settlements and everything else. You can see why Clinton didn't veto it in October 2000. You remember what these conventions are. These were enacted after the Second World War in order to give formal criminalization to the crimes of the Nazis. And it would take some gall to veto that, you know. So he just abstained, and the press kept quiet about it. And as I say, Bush went further. These are ways of enhancing terrorism. You know? And it's not just this, it's a whole slew of other things, which are just not discussed here. I mean, any more than, you know, any other things that we're responsible for are discussed or taught or anything else.
How do you feel that we can motivate that discussion, though? I mean, how do you feel?
Same way you do it on everything else. I mean, say take, I talked about Cuban Missile Crisis. That same year, 1962, remember some other things happened, important ones. Have a lot of lessons. In 1962, Kennedy administration announced publicly that U.S. planes are taking part in the bombing of with U.S. pilots. You know, U.S. are taking part in the bombing of South Vietnam. They initiated chemical warfare to destroy food crops. They began programs that were driving ultimately millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps. This is all war against South Vietnam. No Russians, no Chinese, in fact not even any North Vietnamese if they're not supposed to be allowed to be in their own country. It was an attack against South Vietnam. That was public. Did anybody care about it? I mean, there was no protest. You know, you couldn't get two people in a room to talk about it. It was just considered legitimate. I mean, that's the way you treat these people. You want to bomb them? Okay, bomb them. I mean, it took years of really hard work, and not just talk, but resistance and serious resistance and all sorts of things before you finally got opposition going. And it did come way too late. I mean, much too late to save the country, but it came. And it was part of something that really changed the society. Okay, that's the way you do it. Same in this case. It is not going to happen by itself.
Hi. I really want to thank you for coming, and I agree with a lot of the things that you've said tonight. As a mother of 2 disabled children and a disabled veteran myself, I lived in Germany during the 80s. I was a soldier in Germany during the 80s. I lived with terroristic threat every day. I had to check my car for a bomb every single day. The day I left Germany,
You're talking about Red Brigades and...
Yeah.
Yeah.
The day I left Germany to change a station back to the United States, a bomb was placed on my TWA airplane that had to be removed.
That's right.
I lived in a country where the airports are patrolled by German policemen with Uzis, where the police have authorization to stop, put up a blockade on any street, on any Autobahn, and search your car without the... This is a democratically led country. Now, saying that, I love my country. I was a soldier for my country. But there are a lot of things that are wrong with my country that need to be changed. I change it with my vote, with my opinion, with me talking out. You have the right to do that on this stage because you live in this country and you don't have to fear about standing up against a wall and being shot for your opinion. Give thanks, give praise, and thank God you've got people wearing a uniform that are willing to defend your rights to stand up there and speak your mind, and for all of you to feel the way you feel and to vote the way you want to vote. A lot of countries in this world do not have and cannot afford that opportunity,
That's right.
even though they are so-called democratic countries.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Saying that, I demonstrated against the Vietnam War. I'm 50 years old. I walked with my feet. With my feet, I walked and demonstrated against a war that I thought was unjust. I do not think what we will do in Iraq is unjust. Saddam Hussein scares the hell out of me. I see a lot of parallels with what's going on now to what was happening in the 30s with Hitler. This country did not intervene with Hitler because we were an isolationist country.
I don't understand your question.
My question is, if we have the opportunity to stop Saddam Hussein now without it becoming an event like World War II became and keeping it on a much smaller scale, should not we do that?
If you can give an argument that Saddam Hussein is anything like Hitler, the answer is yes.
His idol is Hitler.
Look, there are a lot of people whose idol is Hitler, but the question is, can he do anything? See, look, there was a time when Saddam Hussein was a threat. Saddam Hussein is a threat to anyone within his reach. But his reach happens to be very limited, fortunately. That's why none of the countries in the Gulf are afraid of him, and they're all afraid of us, right? Because they know that his reach is limited. If Saddam Hussein, there was a time when he was much more dangerous. That was the time when George Bush #1 was providing him with assistance in developing weapons of mass destruction after his crimes were known. Okay, now what has happened since then? What's happened since then is Iraq was demolished in the First Gulf War. Through the 1990s, it's had severe sanctions which have practically devastated the civilian society. It's been under a harsh arms inspection regime, which was far more effective than bombing in eliminating weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. effectively withdrew the inspectors in 1998. To the extent that there's a threat there, and I think there is, anyone within his reach is threatened, there's a simple way to deal with it, that is get the inspectors back, which the U.S. is trying to block.
And to let them into the palace. You notice that his people live in relative, have harsh sanctions, but he has 12 palaces that are...
Fine, then go in and look at the palaces. The question is, can he do anything? You know, if you were in the RAND Corporation, where their job is to estimate possible threats and ways to deal with them, I'll bet you they don't even have a committee dealing with Saddam Hussein for a very simple reason. It's nothing like Hitler. Weapons of mass, there's nothing to do with him being a nice guy. He's a rotten guy, and the U.S. knew it when it supported him, because they didn't care that he was a rotten guy, and we certainly should not trust to deal with him anyone who supported him right through his worst crimes. That's insane.
Hitler wasn't a threat either in the early
let's take a look at the threat. Weapons of mass destruction are of value. You can use them either for deterrence or for attack, only if someone knows that you have them. Okay? It's elementary. Like if I happen to have nuclear weapons in my backyard, I can't use them for deterrence or for attack. The instant that Saddam Hussein gives any indication that he has weapons of mass destruction, he'll be obliterated. He knows it. If he ever made the slightest move anywhere, ever, be obliterated. If he wants to commit suicide, there are easier ways. Just shoot yourself. There is not it's an extremely remote possibility that he could ever use weapons of mass destruction. What he may be doing is just what the CIA warned, namely scattering terrorists with the option of using weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent to a U.S. attack. So if we want to, create a possibility, because there's none now to speak of, that he might use weapons of mass destruction, the way to do it is to attack him. Now, suppose that, to compare this with Hitler just doesn't make any sense. Hitler was conquering the world. Saddam Hussein can't move. He can't even indicate. Pardon? Wait a minute, but that's right, and there would have been no point intervening in the early 30s. What there would have been a point in doing is preventing Germany at the time of the takeover of the Sudetenland and Austria and Czechoslovakia. All of that would have been a right thing to do, but we didn't do that. And there's nothing like that happening here. Saddam Hussein attacked two countries, right? First one he attacked with our support, Iran. That was the war that went on for 8 years. Finally, it ended with Iranian capitulation because the U.S. intervened on the side of Saddam Hussein, right? I'll have to run through the record. That's the time when he was using gas against Iranians and against the Kurds, and the U.S. supported him, as did Britain, and continued to provide him with weapons of mass destruction. Certainly not going to trust those guys to do something about it. The same people who supported him then, who's going to trust them? There is a way to deal with whatever, fortunately, quite limited threat he poses. The best way is to get inspectors back. That's why it is, that's why almost the entire world is opposed to the U.S. policy of preventing inspectors from going back. And that's exactly what's going on. They want the inspectors back. The U.S. is trying to block it because it wants to go to war. But let's go a step further. Suppose that anyone were seriously believed what you're saying. I don't think anyone in power or anyone near it does. Certainly the regional countries don't. Suppose anyone believed it. Okay, we got to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We got to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. We have to prevent Iraq from ever having them again. There's an easy way to do it, which nobody is talking about. That's what I was hinting about before. The obvious way to do it is just to encourage Iran to invade. It's perfect. Oh, sure they will. They hate Saddam Hussein, and they have much more reason to want to get rid of him and to get rid of not only his weapons of mass destruction, but any potential possibility for a successor regime to get rid of him. They have way more than we do. After all, they were his victims. We were helping them. Okay? Sure, they'd be happy to do it. Maybe we'd have to give them some logistic support. Okay? Like we could bomb from a distance or some safe distance or something. It's a perfect answer. They'll do it. They'll get rid of Saddam. They'll tear him to shreds. They'll get rid of weapons of mass destruction. They'll make sure that nobody else ever does it. There won't be any American casualties. There's no threat to Israel because they're not going to respond to Israel. He'll be welcomed by the population way more than we will. 60% of the population is Shiite. They're going to be cheering from the streets of Basra and Karbala when Iran comes in, unlike when we go in. They'll happily allow us access to Iranian oil. Perfect solution. Why doesn't anybody talk about it? Okay? Even talking about it is ludicrous. It's never been mentioned. Why? Well, because it doesn't meet the requirements. It would get rid of Saddam Hussein. It would get rid of weapons of mass destruction. It would allow U.S. Companies to have access to Iraqi oil. There'd be no American casualties, no Israeli casualties, no problems with the UN. But it misses two crucial points. It does not leave the U.S. in control of the second largest oil reserves in the world, which it can use as a lever of world power. And two, it doesn't deal with the domestic problems of the Bush administration, which are to try to frighten people enough so that they're not going to oppose it. Other than that, think it through. It's a fine solution. And the reason it's never mentioned is because nobody seriously believes any of the stuff they're saying. I mean, think it through. You know, why hasn't it ever been, maybe there's some flaw in it. Why hasn't it ever been mentioned? It's a pretty obvious idea. Pardon? No, it's not that they'd have to admit they made a mistake. I mean, they wouldn't have to say anything. Don't say anything. Just say, yeah, we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We're going to destroy his weapons of mass destruction. We don't want American casualties. We don't want Israeli casualties. We want access to the oil. Fine, we'll unleash Iran. I mean, you'd be sent to a lunatic asylum if you said that. Because everyone in the back of their minds knows that none of this has to do with what's going on. Okay? If you believe one word they're saying, that's what they would be calling for. But of course you can't believe a word they're saying.
Sir, I have an
I
understanding.
think, we got some poor working people here who have to go home.
Yes. I have an understanding of this young
Last question, I'm afraid. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm glad I got up here.
Pardon?
My father is the only person I have ever met who sounds just like you. He died.
I can't
After
hear, I'm
him,
sorry.
I didn't find anyone who sounded like you until I discovered you. So.
Can you hear?
When I read Candide and 1984 and Animal Farm, when I was 10, Candide. You can't hear me? Here we go.
I can't hear, I'm sorry.
Okay. The only person I ever met was my father, who sounds like you. He's died.
Who
Okay.
was?
My father.
The only person who what?
I've ever met who sounds like you.
Oh.
And I am fascinated with everything you say. And I have to tell you, he talked and talked and talked. And I believed what he said. And I read what he told me to read. And I became very depressed.
What is the question?
And I want to ask you, what I found was that I didn't know how to stay informed, that it was too hard to find the material. And I found that I could listen one way to the press and hear all the most absurd jokes of propaganda and laugh at everything I heard, or I could just believe it passively. This is after they had committed him.
I'm sorry, I'm just not
I know.
catching what you said. I can't hear it.
What I'm saying is, I graduated from high school with no idea of what I could do besides become a terrorist, frankly.
If you could become a terrorist?
That was my plan.
Why should you become a terrorist?
Because the world...
I mean, if you want to become a terrorist, just to,
well, they taught me to
join the
make...
Bush administration.
He taught me to make... He taught me to make some really fine Molotov cocktails.
Pardon?
But anyway, he taught me to make Molotov cocktails. But the thing is, what I found is, there's something called cinesound.
There's something called what?
It comes from cynicism
Cynicism?
and surround sound.
And?
Cinesound.
I'm sorry.
Cinesound is what you do.
Something's wrong. I can't hear what you're saying.
No. Don't be elitist. Listen for a second, please.
Can anybody hear? Can anybody repeat? Nobody can hear you.
Okay,
Sorry.
how's this? This better? Cinesound is listening to the news and hearing the lies. You don't have to read the Christian Science Monitor. What's good to me about listening to you is hearing that you know the names of what's being done. You know about the Fourth Geneva Convention. You know the names of this Netherlands thing.
What is the question?
The question is, do you have a website? How does one stay informed?
How do I know? I mean, I could do it the same way you do. You know, it's all public material. You do enough work, you know about it. There's no secrets.